Welcome to meeting number 91 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Science and Research. Before I begin, I'd ask all members and other participants to consult the cards on the table regarding guidelines with respect to our earphones and feedback. We need to protect the hearing health of our interpreters. Thank you all for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. For those participating virtually, I'd like to draw your attention to a few rules. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your understanding in this regard. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083I and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, January the 31st, 2023, the committee resumes its study of science and research in Canada's Arctic in relation to climate change. It is now my pleasure to welcome, as an individual, Aldo Kirchhoff, Professor of Maritime Law and Policy, and Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot, Director, Energy, Natural Resources and Environment, Donald Laurier Institute, joining us by video conference. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Dr. Exner-Pirot, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Chair and committee members. Thanks for inviting me to appear this morning. I would like to preface my remarks by sharing my own involvement in and experience with Arctic research. I began my career working for the University of the Arctic in 2003, a network of universities, colleges, research institutes, and other organizations concerned with education and research in about the North. I later completed my PhD at the University of Calgary in political science, focused on Arctic security, after which I worked at the International Centre for Northern Governance and Development at the University of Saskatchewan. I spent 2 terms, one as chair with the Canadian Northern Studies Trust, which administered over $1 million annually in student scholarships. Currently, I am the managing editor of the Arctic Yearbook, an annual peer-reviewed publication focused on Arctic politics and security. I am a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Polar Institute, a member of the North American Arctic Defense Security Network, a member of the Yukon Government's Arctic Security Advisory Council, and I sit on the board of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. My recent work with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has focused on energy and resource development and Indigenous industry relations in Western and Northern Canada, but I'm still active in Arctic research. I say all this because when we think of Arctic research, we tend to think of climate change and the natural sciences, which is reflected in the study itself. No one will dispute that it's important and a priority. However, the focus on climate change has often come at the expense of other areas of study. The funding bias in favor of environmental sciences and against social sciences, business, and engineering is well documented. The University of the Arctic conducted analysis of global academic publications in Arctic research last year. They found that almost a third focused on environmental sciences, while only 9% were in the social sciences, 4% in engineering, and 4% in the humanities. A report released in April by UArctic, which was funded by Global Affairs Canada, also showed an even starker divide with regards to funding. That's not surprising, as natural science research is structurally more expensive than social science and humanities research, but it is symbolic of what we prioritize. I have observed through the conferences I've attended, the research proposals I've assessed, and the articles I have peer-reviewed that Canadian Arctic studies have their own biases, and research funding gets applied to a relatively narrow set of research questions. Climate change, traditional knowledge, renewable energy, and the negative impacts of resource development sit at the top of the list. There is nothing wrong with this list, but there are dozens of other important fields of study that lack funding and people. I will provide 2 quick examples. The first is that, to my knowledge, there is not a single Canadian economist who specializes in the Arctic region. I know of only 1 or 2 Arctic economists from Alaska and Russia. Just think about that. The region's environment and original inhabitants are well studied, but there is not a robust group of thinkers helping to inform economic development. The other is the narrow lens which we apply to understanding climate changes. Looking only at sea ice changes, which is well funded and studied, one might expect shipping in the Canadian Arctic to grow dramatically. In fact, this is often taken for granted and repeated in speeches and op-eds. In my own research, however, I have come to understand that other factors are much more important to whether or not shipping increases in the Canadian Arctic or not than sea ice change, namely the economics of resource development. Investment decisions are tied to commodity cycles, not sea ice melt. I expect a lack of intellectual diversity and multidisciplinary in Arctic studies means we often miss important considerations for many research questions beyond my own narrow research interests. Finally, I want to touch on some of the trade-offs of our approach to conducting research with Northern and Indigenous communities. There's a long history of scientists using traditional knowledge without requesting permission or providing credit, of entering traditional territories and conducting experiments without notifying or obtaining consent from local governments, and getting funding to advance scientific goals and advance academic careers without ever returning knowledge or research that is useful to Arctic communities. This is well acknowledged, and I'm sure you have heard and will hear from many researchers the work that has gone on to remediate and change these circumstances with many new positive relationships. This is to be applauded. But I've also seen layers of bureaucracy applied to Arctic research that has made it more expensive and exclusive, that has placed administrative burdens on Indigenous communities and Northern governments, and has deterred or prevented young graduate-level researchers from pursuing their interests in Arctic studies because the process was too difficult and lengthy. There is a balance to be found between exploiting and disregarding Northern communities on the one hand, and imposing hurdles to research that are so high that we simply conduct less important research on the other. I'm not convinced we have found the right balance. I'm grateful you're taking the time to study this important topic and ensure the efforts we put into Arctic research provide the greatest possible benefits to Canadians, in particular those that live in the region. There is often a lot of attention paid to methodology, but too little to impact. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Professor Kirkhope for an opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the Standing Committee for inviting me to appear before it today. I appear in my personal capacity as Professor of Maritime Law and Policy with a specialty in the regulation of polar shipping based at Dalhousie University. My statement today concerns research needs for the governance of Arctic shipping at a time of change in Inuit Nunangat, which is the term for Canadian Arctic waters in Inuktitut. The increasing accessibility of Arctic waters to navigation because of climate change and consequential progressive sea ice loss means more ships and more diverse regional shipping. The growth of shipping will have positive and negative consequences. The ability to maximize the potential benefits of shipping while mitigating or even preventing adverse consequences demands robust governance of shipping. I submit that aspects of both the international and domestic governance of polar shipping are not sufficient to protect the unique and most sensitive Arctic marine environment. Despite celebrating 10 years in existence, the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code is a first-generation instrument. It was the product of consensus based on the lowest common denominator, that is, what IMO member states were able to agree to. Hence, despite proposals to address broader environmental concerns from shipping, it only focused on oily waste, noxious liquid substances in bulk, sewage and garbage, but it did not regulate air pollution including black carbon, ballast water management, grey water, underwater noise and other environmental risks in the polar context. Even on maritime safety, some of the Polar Code standards are insufficient, such as safety equipment to enable survivability until rescue. Recently, Canada succeeded in persuading the IMO to designate Canadian Arctic waters as an emission control area for sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter under an international convention for the prevention of pollution from ships. And this will be formally adopted in October this year. To comply with the emission control standards, ship will either have to use low sulfur content fuel or install a scrubber, which is a machine basically on board the ship, to remove the sulfur, and thereby be still able to use heavy fuel oil. In particular, open-loop scrubbers produce highly acidic wash water containing harmful substances that pollute the marine environment. It might be argued that the IMO ban on the use and carriage for use of heavy fuel oil in Arctic waters, which becomes effective on the 1st of July this year, may mitigate the pollution risks. However, for some ships that meet a particular construction standard, the regulation takes effect only on the 1st of July of 2029. Also, Arctic coastal states, so including Canada, may waive the ban for their ships until the 1st of July of 2029. The effect is to prolong the risk of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic marine environment until 2029. Indeed, there is great need for more research to help better understand safety and environmental regulatory weaknesses in polar shipping, and thereby to help integrate and update international standards. But there's a further dimension to all of this, and that is that a robust governance system needs regulatory equity. Inuit organizations were not involved in the development of the IMO Polar Code, so that their voices and knowledge that could have significantly aided regulatory development were not considered. It was only recently that the Inuit Circumpolar Council was granted provisional consultative status at the IMO so that Inuit voices can be heard and to inform regulatory development. Now, while there is extensive scholarly research on Arctic shipping generally, there is relatively little research on the interface between maritime regulation, how we regulate ships in other words, and indigenous rights generally, and especially Inuit rights, Inuit traditional knowledge known as IQ, and Inuit law. As an aside, the Hannitak Clean Arctic Shipping Initiative, which is a new research project recently funded through the Canada First Research Excellence Fund and co-led by Memorial University of Newfoundland and ICC, is leading a consortium of universities, including my university, to commence this type of research. Madam Chair, I conclude my statement with two matters. The first is there is a need to review the adequacy and robustness of international polar shipping standards and their implementation in Canada and Inuit Nunangat, how gaps can be addressed, how safety and environmental standards can be strengthened in an integrated manner. And second, there is a need to support capacity building for Inuit organizations to enable meaningful engagement in the complexities of the governance of polar shipping. Thank you. Merci. Nakurmik.
And thank you very much for your opening statement. We'll now follow up with questions from the floor. Please be sure to indicate to whom your questions are directed. And we'll start a question round for 6 minutes with MP Rempel Garner.
Thank you, Chair. I'll direct my questions to Dr. Exner-Pureau. Always nice to address another Calgarian, even if it's virtually. We've heard a lot of testimony at the committee about the importance of having a national Arctic research strategy that could link some of the objectives of Canada's Arctic strategy as well as some of our defense strategies. Is this something that you would recommend?
Great question. So I have been involved with the Inuit Development Corporations Associations on some elements of NORAD modernization, and I have written on particular innovations that would be useful not only for communities and for mining development, but also for defense, specifically with regards to transportation, energy, and communications. And the special little innovative technologies that I like that I think should be tested more greatly in the Arctic are things like microreactors. We are seeing a lot.
I only have 6 minutes, so okay. I'm going to try and get through as many questions.
The answer is yes. There are many things that we should be applying.
Okay, so then I think you're preempting some of my next questions, which is great. What should the content of that report or that strategy focus on? So you've presented some, I think, non-obvious observations to the committee that nobody else has made yet, that are nonpartisan. But they really haven't been brought up by any other experts in committee testimony, specifically that Canada's Arctic research strategy should be including economic analysis, foreign policy posture recommendations. Could you go through sort of specific bullet point examples or recommendations of what areas should be included in a Arctic research strategy that really we don't have a focus on right now, and why those would be important?
Yeah, so number one for me is economic development. Of course, that's what I focus on. But I think there is a bias towards looking at resource development, economic development as normatively bad, maybe as capitalism or exploitation. But of course, when you talk to people in the territories or Indigenous communities, they would like to see development. They would just like to have some control and ownership and partnership in it. And I don't think that's represented in academia.
On that point, we have had some testimony where we have heard, and certainly in Canada's Arctic strategy right now, it says that there's like one or two throwaway lines saying that communities wanted natural resource developments and that they were consulted, but that's not reflected in the body of the overall Arctic strategy. What recommendations could the committee make to ensure that an Arctic research strategy looks at resource development in a more neutral way than perhaps has been presented by the government in the past?
Exactly. So it could be funding. Again, I think we need some graduate students. Like I say, there are no economists that I know of that look at the Arctic. There's very few, political scientists like myself that look at political economy. And so we need to build some of that capacity, even statistical analysis, things that are left to the territories themselves right now. Then I will say engineering. Again, it gets very little. I don't think there's a lot of engineers that have been to the Canadian Arctic. And I find that the ability to develop new technologies that serve the needs, the very distinct needs of remote communities, are not going to be developed by people who have never been there. And so we need to, bring that collaboration together of the engineers and the communities to figure out what actually works in those communities, what are the technical challenges that they have. I think we're still doing kind of 20th century technologies poorly in the Arctic. And then, so there's economic development, engineering, I had a third one in mind. Oh, you mentioned foreign policy. We do tend to focus on defense, and we do focus on legal aspects, I think. But our foreign policy has been getting weaker. I think for the Arctic region as a whole, there's less attention paid to foreign policy.
The last thing that I found really important in your remarks were the fact that the interaction with First Nations and Indigenous persons in the Arctic seems to be a one-way street. And that actually underscores the fact that the conversation around resource development as well seems to be sort of very ideologically rigid in terms of it being quote unquote bad. How could an Arctic research strategy, or what recommendation would you make for an Arctic research strategy that would alleviate, I think a entrenched, rigid ideology that's rarely challenged in Canadian academia or in federal funding structures?
And I say this as someone who's worked in universities and now works in think tanks, maybe for a reason. Everyone I know who's in Arctic research is a good person and doing their best, so I don't mean to diminish anyone. But of course, the background of people who are interested in Arctic studies, who like to go out and work on the land, do field research, who work in a university, is a particular subset of person, and they tend to have the same values. And so I think a lot of things get missed because there isn't a lot of intellectual diversity and maybe professional diversity.
So just in the last seconds that I have here, you're recommending that a Canadian Arctic research strategy have an actual stated value of intellectual diversity as something that we should be striving for on policy in Arctic research?
I would think so, and make sure you maybe even list the different sections, the different disciplines that you would hope to fund research, so they don't all kind of funnel into the same silo.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now turn to MP Diab for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome to both of our witnesses this morning. I'll direct my questions to Dr. Shirkup. It's always nice to see an Atlantic Canadian, particularly a Haligonian, and somebody from a professor of maritime law from Dalhousie. Dr. Shirkup, there's two things that I think I'd like to ask you on, and I'm going to give you time to actually respond, as opposed to. So let me just ask the questions first. You talked about two important things, maybe probably more, but two. One, greater research needed on safety and environmental, and then also you stressed the importance of Inuit participation in maritime regulation and shipping. So with regards to the second point, how might we follow up with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act with regards to the shipping in the Arctic. And I'm going to give you all the time you need.
Thank you very much. I realize that the time is limited to the 6 minutes, probably, that you have. And excellent questions, and thank you very much for those. Certainly, on the safety side, we know because of the remoteness of the region and the lack of infrastructure, we have some real challenges if we have the need for humanitarian assistance for users of the marine environment in remote areas. And our capacity to intervene the farther north we go is significantly limited. So there is safety, at least from the angle of search and rescue, and also safety of those that do provide search and rescue services. But there is also the dimension of safety for those on board ships. We're beginning to see more and more cruise shipping interest and also small pleasure craft. And what we have to consider here is that we do have international standards for equipment to enable survival until rescue services reach those in distress. But what we know now through research is that those standards are insufficient. They are essentially aimed at ensuring survivability for up to 5 days, so in terms of clothing, supplies, and so on. But what we know is that, indeed, because of remoteness, that we might need more than 5 days to reach somebody in distress. And in the meantime, their equipment and the levels of nutrition that they need would not be sufficient to enable them to survive. So with the current standards that we have, there is a real danger that we could have, God forbid, a situation where we do have a major casualty, but we could be looking at very serious risks to human life. So clearly, safety on board ships, safety standards for surviving, but also safety for those that work on board ships. With respect to the second question, and in particular with respect to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the committee will recall, of course, that this important piece of federal legislation has committed Canada to implement UNDRIP and essentially to review federal legislation to enable its implementation. And essentially, the commitment there is generic, basically to any legislation which is relevant. And I would argue that would include maritime legislation. That includes, indeed, the legal frameworks that we have for the regulation of shipping right across the country, and of course, for us, because we have an interest in the Arctic, in the north. And that would mean, for instance, that we would need to take another look at the Canada Shipping Act 2001, the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, and a range of other statutes. And we have indeed a long list of statutes, maritime law statutes that apply in the north, and to see how UNDRIP can be implemented through these statutes. And I'll give you an example of, for instance, the relevance of UNDRIP here for informing federal legislation. There is a duty for states in UNDRIP to protect the environment in a manner to enable indigenous peoples to exercise their rights. So we have to be particularly cognizant here of the range of risks that we are seeing from the potential industrialization activities in the north to the environment, and therefore potentially that might affect adversely the interests of indigenous peoples. So more ships, for example, will mean more noise. More noise will have impacts on a range of species and the ecosystem. Plus, of course, more ships may require more ice breaking for the shoulder seasons and so on, which means there's the potential of potentially disrupting Inuit ice routes, the movement of animals on ice, and so on. So there's a range of potential environmental impacts here that we can anticipate, and therefore it would be important for us to have a legal framework that anticipates these potential risks. I hope I've answered your questions.
Thank you. We've heard previous testimony on increased frequency of wildfires and flooding. So so how can we help better protect the infrastructure from these climate change resilience from your studies, if you are able to offer any advice on that?
Unfortunately, my background has not enabled me to address other aspects of infrastructure other than infrastructure to support shipping. And of course, the major concern that we do have in the north is the relative lack of infrastructure. Although there's been progress, certainly progress in terms of undertaking hydrographic surveys, and there's been thinking perhaps of developing, strengthening perhaps port facilities in the north, of which we have very, very little, and potentially also navigation aids and so on. So the concern perhaps for shipping is not so much the wildfires and so on in northern regions, but perhaps more the impact of climate change and what this might mean to the infrastructure, the little infrastructure that we have there. For instance, infrastructure that may rely on permafrost for its stability, and the loss of permafrost would, of course, be a threat to infrastructure.
Thank you. I think we're at point. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Sherkup, for appearing this morning.
Thank you. We'll now turn to MP Blanchard-Jocas for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je salue les témoins qui sont avec nous aujourd'hui.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and to our witnesses. I have a question for Heather Pira. It has been mentioned that the objectives of scientific research in the North are limited because of a lack of funding. And we even see that according to government changes, when government changes, there is a change in the funding that is available. Sometimes that money that was there for scientific research will move over to defense or might be moved to Indigenous peoples, communities. So I would like to hear you about the need for ongoing, continuing funding, which will allow you to meet the objectives of your research.
Thank you very much for the question. I think government changes in policy going from black to white and white to black is a challenge for many people. In the research that I do, which is more focused on political science and social science, I think there could be a lot greater overlap with defense, with Indigenous communities, and with Arctic research. And so maybe thinking of it more holistically of how all these different pockets of funding can reinforce and leverage with each other instead of being very, applied to, for example, a particular university and a particular program and a particular set number of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. So maybe, I know this is tricky, but trying to fund outcomes instead of funding processes, maybe there's something to rebalancing it there.
Est-ce que vous diriez que
Would you agree then that funding for social sciences and the humanities in the North is undervalued?
I mean, the evidence, there's clear evidence. It's, you'd say objectively, quantitatively, it's very disproportionate. I know, I appreciate how expensive it is to do natural science research in the Arctic. And so I don't even know if I'd say that there's enough natural science research in the Canadian Arctic either, considering how much territory we have. I think Norway spends more on Arctic research than Canada is right now, which is a little bit embarrassing. And so I think we could have more of everything. But I think it wouldn't take a lot more money to get a lot more value out of social science research, especially political science, out of economics. It doesn't always have to be on the land. It's more just about going to communities, which is expensive. And so I think we could be getting more value out of the money that we do have. And I think, it wouldn't take a lot more money to get a lot more impact.
Merci. Écoutez, je suis d'accord avec vous.
Thank you. I agree with you that the sciences, the natural resources is much more costly, engineering and so on. But when you look at what is done for transporting oil and gas for export, to my mind, it's a matter of policy. Dominique Berthaud from the Chair of Research at the University of Quebec in Rimouski has said that research supports a short duration access for programs. He would propose long-term programs. What do you think of his proposal?
I mean, I do agree. If you look at the Canadian, research system and the environment, how much money is put into actual proposals and to getting the funding. And it's kind of a waste of human resources, and we're all fighting over the same small pie. And so you're not getting more value from more people competing for that same small pie. So in some sense, having longer term funding allows people, I think, to answer research questions in a more comprehensive way, to not have to focus their efforts on always trying to get more funding. I think our best and brightest research chairs are chasing funding is probably the major part of their job, which is probably not where we want them to direct their efforts. So in general, yes, I would agree with that.
Merci beaucoup. Beaucoup de témoins.
Thank you. A lot of witnesses have mentioned the need to have a coordinated strategy amongst the different researchers or research chairs. We know that there are a variety of organizations pursuing this type of research now in the North, there should be some sort of a coordinating body. That there should be, in a sense, a global structure. I'd like to hear your comments on this type of vision for research in the North that is coordinated.
Well, I mentioned that I worked at the University of the Arctic, and I still participate in this university, which is, again, a consortium, not an actual university. And I think probably the best and smartest thing it's done is what it's called thematic networks, where it does bring together Arctic research across the 8 Arctic countries and elsewhere to focus on a particular issue or a particular theme. And it has produced very good results, I would say. So perhaps again, organizing around particular outcomes, particular needs of society, and having, some deliverables, having some goals of answering some of those and not just producing publications. Again, that's where the system, I think, lets us down, is that getting funding and producing publications are what's valued most. And in Arctic research, I think there's much more need for practical solutions and outcomes.
De votre point de vue d'experte, là.
From your point of view as an expert, if you were to define the major objectives for research in the Arctic, what would they be from the perspective of the humanities and your hard research?
Well, I mean, some of it is environmental for sure, to understand it. But I also want to point out that understanding climate change in the Arctic isn't mitigating climate change. And so you still need to reduce, carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. Just understanding how it's affecting the Arctic doesn't do anything to mitigate it. And so there are some things like reducing black carbon and reducing diesel generation that actually mitigate climate change. Community health is obviously a big one, and it is reasonably well funded, I think, but that tends to be a priority of communities. Infrastructure, which I think is underfunded. And so just, again, getting the brightest and smartest people to think about infrastructure with the challenges in the Arctic, I don't think happens often.
And that's well over our time. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you.
And economics, that would be the last one.
Okay, so now we'll turn to MP Cannings for our final round for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you both to both witnesses for being here. I'm going to start with Dr. Shirkop. You talked about the challenges that climate change is bringing to the Arctic and the opportunities with increased shipping, especially in your field of study, and the need to involve communities, the need to use the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to inform that. Just wondering if you could really clarify where we are now compared with other countries, other areas. How does, say, our safety standards for shipping in the Canadian Arctic stack up to safety standards elsewhere in the world, whether it's, the Mediterranean or other, quite different areas?
Thank you for that important question. Of course, the Arctic is its own context, and it's very different from other regions where the infrastructure is much more well developed. So the Mediterranean, for instance, has a very long history with very extensive port system. So essentially, there are platforms to provide services at sea throughout the region. That is not the case in the Arctic, and especially, I think, in our part of the Arctic, where the infrastructure is certainly leaves much to be desired. In terms of standards, we are comparable to the other Arctic states. So we compare like with the, let's say, the other 4 Central Arctic Ocean states. Because we are all parties to the IMO conventions, so we've all implemented the Polar Code, which has safety and pollution prevention standards. So essentially, on the books, the laws and regulations are comparable to a great extent. There are some important differences, however. For us, there is actually something that we have more than the other Arctic states. Now that we have an emission control area designated, which will be formally adopted later on this year. So that will be actually a step ahead of the other Arctic states. But in terms of capabilities for search and rescue and so on, if we compare ourselves to the Norwegians, well, the Norwegians perhaps are farther ahead than us, but then we're looking at much smaller areas than the Canadian Arctic. If we're looking at the environmental standards, we could improve on certain things, like, for instance, perhaps be more precautionary with respect to the amount of noise that is being generated by more ships in the region. Perhaps take a harder stance on the discharge of grey water from ships, especially passenger vessels. And I would suggest maybe take a harder stance on heavy fuel oil, because we have positioned ourselves in a way to grant certain exemptions to vessels to continue to use heavy fuel oil when we know that that poses certain risk. So we're ahead of others in some respects. On other respects, perhaps not necessarily ahead.
Okay, and just again to focus in on the particular concerns in the Arctic, climate change is affecting the Arctic much faster than it is us down here. And also in the Arctic, we have communities that are much more dependent on the land and sea for food. We have, the Inuit requiring the ice for seal fishing, for whaling, and to get out on the land to hunt caribou. So would you say there's perhaps an even, higher priority to maintain the environment and to mitigate pollution, air pollution, water pollution, noise pollution?
Absolutely. And what we have to consider, too, is that a major difference between the interests of shipping and Inuit interests is that shipping needs to have clear, open water. Whereas Inuit, in areas where there are Inuit ice routes and there's Inuit hunting, subsistence, perhaps temporary camps on ice, the ice is needed. And the ice is needed for safety. So there have been concerns, for instance, where you could have ice breakers basically breaking apart, and then the way the ice reforms potentially poses a barrier for hunters to return back safely to their homes. So for us, we probably have a higher responsibility, I would say, than perhaps the other Arctic states, because of the particular geography and the particular demographics in the region and the social-cultural importance of the region. And not to forget, too, that this is the homeland of Inuit. So this is not just a superhighway for ships ready to be opened. Well, this is, essentially a space which is important for subsistence, for culture, for identity, and so on. So we do have a higher responsibility, I would argue.
Chair, how much? 28 seconds. So I guess I would just ask you then, we've heard testimony about new research policies and programs that specifically are coordinated with communities, developed right from the start within communities throughout the Arctic. Do you think that's the model that Arctic research should try to follow?
I'm involved in one of these. In fact, when I mentioned Hanitak, Hanitak is actually an Inuktitut word which means freshly fallen snow, a metaphor for a fresh beginning, and to focus on shipping. Can we think about shipping differently? And this project is co-led by Memorial University of Newfoundland and the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And this is the first ever, kind of the first research excellence fund that is being co-led by an organization which is not a university.
Thank you very much. So we'll now start our second round of questioning for this panel. We'll begin that with MP Tucker for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for our witnesses. My first questions will be for Mrs. Exner-Perot. I found your article on May 16th in the Financial Post riveting. You discussed rare earth mining in the territories in the state, and to quote it says, in many ways we are playing right into their hands, which is the PRC. Could you elaborate on how Canada's critical minerals policies are playing into the hands of the PRC?
Well, it is our approach to shifting energy systems to things that are critical minerals intensive rather than things that we have in Canada, which is uranium and nuclear power that doesn't require enrichment, and of course fossil fuels, which you could use carbon capture to make it carbon neutral. So making our energy systems dependent on what we know are Chinese supply chains. We've seen our American neighbors to the south imposing very heavy tariffs to avoid this problem, is what I was getting at.
So it does play into a foreign country's interests, their current policy that they're utilizing. Back to some of your analysis and research that is done on infrastructure in the north. Can you elaborate a little bit broadly on communities that does have natural resource projects such as a mine? What is the infrastructure like around those communities, and are they is that infrastructure built to withstand some of the changes in climate change better than, say, other communities that have zero economic impact or activity?
Great, yeah. Great question. The reason I'm not too worried about too much shipping is because it's still so expensive to get metals and minerals out of the Arctic. I don't foresee, there aren't the deposits, there aren't the discovered deposits, there aren't the projects that would indicate that we're going to see, for example, another Mary River iron mine or another Raglan mine in the Canadian Arctic anytime soon. The biggest constraint, again, is the price of the commodity and the cost of the infrastructure. So where we have real growth is in diamonds, in gold and silver, because you can fly those out, because they don't require a lot of infrastructure. To get more copper, to get more nickel, you would need to have a railroad or some kind of road. The only reason we have that great iron mine in Nunavut is because it's very close to tidewater. And so you just have a short way to get it to ships. And it usually goes east, not west, to the Northwest Passage. So the lack of infrastructure is a huge bottleneck to us actually producing those critical minerals in the Arctic.
Important strategy on helping the Arctic is helping the territories, and we know that under this government they've changed the regulation on natural resource projects where there's no new projects being proposed to the mines or being built as we speak. How much of a negative impact has it been to the territories, the change in regulation on natural resources?
So the biggest economic driver in the territories is actually public sector funding and government transfers, federal transfers. And that creates
That might be the problem across Canada as well.
That's a problem. It creates dependence. It creates, I would say, a Dutch disease. Only the public sector is the one absorbing all the talent and all the money rather than the private sector. The other bright spot would be mining. And so, for example, that one iron mine is 25% of Nunavut's GDP. The diamond sector in Northwest Territories is 25% of its GDP. We know that diamond sector is closing. They're reaching the end of the lifespan. Probably by 2030, there'll be no more diamond mining. And we need to start thinking of how are we going to replace it. And I'll tie back to my original statement. It is consultants that are doing some of the work on this. I don't know of any other academic that has thought about, the GDP of these territories, how you would get more mining out, what would be the policies, the regulations. There is no academic attention paid to this fundamental problem for the territories.
You talked about some of the research, and they had hazy outcomes and very little practical solutions. We're looking for simple, common sense solutions. So, if the research that is getting done right now, could we add a requirement, or what are your thoughts of adding a requirement that at least makes them identify practical solutions that comes out of their research versus just research to do more research in the north?
Well, I think that's the solution is in the proposals and in the funding allocation to weigh more heavily on the outcomes. And again, where I have evaluated research proposals, that's very focused on the methodology. And you'll have to ask, give me 2 pages on your methodology. And we become obsessed with the methodology. And it's always, well, we are working with Indigenous communities. But what is the outcome for those communities? So I think just weighing that aspect more heavily would be a big help.
Just the Thank you for the important public service work that you do with the research. Thank you.
And thank you. So now we'll turn to MP Longfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'm going to start my questions off with Dr. Chirkop. On May the 9th, we had a witness at our committee, Jackie Dawson, who's Canada Research Chair in the Human and Policy Dimensions of Climate Change at the University of Ottawa. And she's also Scientific Director of ArcticNet. And she told us that disruption of shipping traffic in the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal, combined with melting of sea ice in the Canadian Arctic, could result in increased marine traffic in the Arctic shipping lanes, including the Northwest Passage. You've reflected some of that in your testimony as well. Do we have enough scientific data to measure the changes that could be affecting the traffic and the marine life?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. Actually, there's a colleague of ours, Frédéric Lasserre, that has done some very interesting work here, which has looked at the extent to which industry is actually interested in using the Northwest Passage.
Right.
And in fact, I don't know if he appeared as a witness. He would be probably an excellent witness for this standing committee. But basically, a point that he underscored in his work is that ship owners are not rushing to build polar-class vessels yet. And there may be a number of factors there, at least not for the Canadian Arctic. The Russian Arctic is a totally different story. But of course, there is the potential of paradigm shifts. And what Professor Dawson was referring to is potentially one of those. What if you have a major disruption to the established maritime routes? Will there be more pressure on the northern routes? In theory, it is possible, but what we have to bear in mind, too, is that shipping in the north is seasonal, whereas shipping through the Panama Canal relies really on world accessibility all year round. And then there's the issue of lack of predictability when how open the season is going to be, the navigation season in the Arctic, shoulder season, and so on. And this could be a real disincentive to simply move shipping through northern waters. And then, of course, there is also the question of infrastructure.
Thank you. And I think you mentioned quite a few variables there, and things are changing. The shoulder season is becoming broader. And there may be a time when the shoulder season really doesn't exist if we continue on current trends. How are we monitoring things like sound? I know on the East Coast, we've been protecting the right whale populations since 2017 when we took some action on shipping traffic in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Is there data on what is acceptable in terms of noise?
That's an excellent question, too, and there's a good deal of uncertainty. We know that noise does have adverse impacts on ecosystems, on species, and potentially also, it seems, on some commercial species, from what I understand from the literature. So there's a potential range of impacts. But of course, in the north, we're especially concerned on those animals upon which Inuit depend. And there is a fair bit of research now looking at underwater noise. I have a colleague at Dalhousie University that has been looking at some of these. His name is David Barkley. I understand that the DRDC has been collecting data. But whether enough has been done to establish a threshold so that we can say, look, we can base a regulation on it. We're not quite there yet. And in fact,
that's where I was going. And thank
exactly.
you for that. Sorry to interrupt, but the second part of this, or third part of this question is, the goal that we have as a government of protecting 30% of Canada's oceans by 2030, by 25% by 2025. Some aggressive goals on protecting oceans. When it comes to regulations, should that include things like noise, or should that include some of the social impacts on Inuit?
Absolutely, yes. I would argue that there's a strong argument here for adopting a precautionary approach. Even though we are not able to establish perhaps a scientific standard yet upon which to base a regulation, we should be able to provide advice, or at least to provide guidance for essentially to try to minimize ships operating in certain areas and their ability to generate underwater noise. So there are some things that we could do.
All of this requires money, and strategies are very expensive. We need to look at how do we fund all this.
But I would argue we need more than money. We need for this also some real commitment at the IMO, because the industry here will take the position that, look, we don't have enough science here to be able to base the standard. So what are we aiming at? This is going to cost us, and so on. But of course, the whole point about precaution is because of the scientific uncertainty, we need to take certain steps. And we need to beef up those standards, which at the moment are purely voluntary at the IMO.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's the end of our time. If you want to expand on that, you can send a written submission to our clerk. That would be welcomed. We will now turn for 2.5 minutes to MP Blanchard-Jocan.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Prochaine question pour...
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Aldo Shokov. I welcome you. I welcome you to our committee. I welcome you to our committee.
Problem? Mic problem?
I hear you now.
Est-ce que ça fonctionne?
Is this working properly? Can you hear me, sir? Well, Madam Chair, I'll start all over again. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you here today. You are the Chair of Research on Maritime Law, and the University of Quebec in Rimouski has a very solid partnership with Dalhousie University in the area of maritime research and the state of the oceans. I would like to ask you a couple of questions today, drawing from your expertise. Given the participation of maritime traffic that you have studied very closely, what consequences would you say that you have observed on the archipelago of the North? What would you say the consequences of this traffic are?
Thank you very much for that very good question, and I may not be able to answer it in its entirety, but I can certainly say that there is a real socio-cultural concern that Inuit communities are really concerned about the increased shipping, and especially if it is shipping and its governance is such that they are not able to participate effectively in it. So basically, as I understand the positions that I've heard, they would certainly like to hear more. They would like their voices to be heard. And for example, through the initiative for the establishment of low-impact shipping corridors, they want to be able to present their concerns and to indicate, indeed, maybe even to inform, provide through their knowledge, perhaps another form of knowledge to complement the science that is going into the designation of the corridors. So I would say, first and foremost, the principal concern is human.
Et concrètement, en termes de politique maritime,
In terms of maritime policy, in terms of research, what should the federal government change? What should it add to its policy to ensure the safety of the environment, but also that of the maritime shipping?
Absolutely, and I think for voices to be heard. And I would suggest, see, traditionally, how has shipping been managed? It has been administered. We've had a system of central administration of shipping. And I would argue we need to move from the notion of administration and more to governance. So basically open up, have more equitable participation, and especially in employing area-based management approaches to shipping. So whenever we are designating spaces, I think it's very important not to forget that these spaces, that these routes for ships are actually through someone else's homeland.
Oh, you got to go. I added more time, so you got 10 seconds. Okay. Are you finished? Are you good with that? Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. We'll now turn to MP Cannings for 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I'd just like to follow on with that conversation with regard, we heard some concerns from Dr. Exner-Pirot about that a lot of the research in the Arctic is aimed at studying the environment, aimed at studying the accumulating and effects of climate change, for instance, and not enough on economics. And your concerns about having Inuit voices heard in directing where research funds might go. Just wondering if you could expand on your previous remarks on how what models are out there for research funding, for programs that would listen to those voices and create research that would benefit Arctic communities.
Thank you very much for that excellent question. And indeed, I would add, of course, in addition to not enough economics, I would say also there is not enough legal research, looking in particular at the relationship between how we're regulating these various industrial activities and the relationship to indigenous rights. And I would say also, specifically with respect to how we're regulating shipping. I find that, we have a fair bit of research publications on the law of the sea aspects, but not so much on the maritime law. And the maritime law is more how we regulate ships. And I think in terms of could we move towards a different model where we have more leadership or rather research, which is not simply involving indigenous partners, but indeed co-led with indigenous organizations. I think perhaps that is where, so this is a step forward. So moving from partnerships to actually co-leading, and also, in other words, to create a better sense of social license for that research. That this research indeed is being more responsive to the concerns that are being advanced by the indigenous organizations themselves, rather than being interpreted by researchers south of 60.
Okay. How much?
6 seconds.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's fine. Okay. Thank you very much to our witnesses on this first panel. We really appreciate your testimony. So if you have anything else supplemental that you would like to add, you may submit that through to the clerk, and we'll suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave, and we'll resume with the second panel of witnesses. Members attending by Zoom, please stay connected to this session. Recognize you by name before speaking. For those of you by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. It's now my pleasure to welcome, as an individual, Dr. Nicholas Burnett, Associate Professor, and actually from Arctic 360, Dr. Jessica Chadian, President and Chief Executive Officer. We'll give you up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Dr. Burnett, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak on this topic. I'm an associate professor and an accredited professional planner in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar working on the human dimensions of environmental change and research governance. I've been working closely with Inuit and First Nations partners in Arctic and subarctic regions of Canada in various capacities, from consultant to student and faculty, since 2006. Much of what I'm going to discuss today relates to work in Nunavut. I'll be focusing on 2 points: whether Arctic and northern populations have the research infrastructure, tools, and funds to participate in research. So in my opinion, some research grants are catching up with the need, providing new, more accessible opportunities for northern populations and Inuit specifically. Some are federal. My experience in getting northern partners to apply for these funds would suggest that some tri-council portals, application requirements are somewhat maladapted to variability in computer literacy and access to reliable internet in some communities. One has to wonder if those opportunities are reaching everyone equitably. As a result, most opportunities still require some measure of Southern-based leadership, although I do see promising signs in the creation of degree-granting colleges and universities in the Arctic, Yukon University, for instance, that built tremendous capacity in the North for the North. This being said, physical community research space is lacking. We often forget that much of research practice has nothing to do with collecting information in the field or on the land. Most is spent in front of a screen, applying for funds, analyzing and interpreting samples, data, and writing about the work. An ongoing study co-led with the Inuit group Iqaluit in Pond Inlet, Nunavut, and one of my graduate students, Sarah Ann Thompson, suggests that community research still occurs in people's homes. This may seem fine from a southern perspective, but ignores the extent to which Nunavut and other jurisdictions are facing housing crises, a lack of safe, healthy indoor space to live and gather. The use of research stations for community research is a gray area that I've also been reflecting on for a few years. There are a good number of federal, territorial, and university-owned research stations in the Arctic serving communities in a variety of ways. I've been working closely with Environment and Climate Change Canada in Pond Inlet, Nunavut, and have made the use of the research station there for years now. My colleagues at ECCC have been very interested in supporting community science. However, there seem to be a number of barriers allowing for local use of these facilities, but this is beyond the scope of my work for now. In my view, this is not the solution, though. If Arctic peoples want to participate actively in science undertaking on their traditional territories, they need physical spaces to do so and need to lead in their creation. Second point, if Arctic science and research collaboration is meaningfully conducted and locally with Indigenous people, Inuit knowledge or Inuit Kayumatukangit, including land-based skills, have been essential to researchers in science in the region for almost 100 years. This relationship has evolved substantially with various technological and transportation advances, but remains important. I'll focus here on the word meaningful, which in my view warrants much more reflection. The meaningfulness of the collaboration or partnership, in my view, is directly tied to the level of Inuit community influence and ultimately control over the research agenda in their homeland. Communities will probably never be able to lead the vast majority of research that takes place on their territory. But research, because research in the Arctic is vast, diverse, and requires tremendous resources. Nonetheless, I think self-determination should be central within a negotiated Arctic research policy. Pulling from recent quantitative systematic reviews of the literature that I led on the evolution, degree, and nature of community engagement in Arctic research, here are a few highlights to consider. Local engagement in Arctic research has only increased slightly since 1965, with a few important nuances that I don't have time to discuss right now. Arctic author-led studies are negligible, less than 1% from 1965 to 2020. We did find that 10% of studies in the last 10 years have had local or community-based authors, which is really, really promising. And finally, that the focus on climate change and global change could be one of the most important and significant drivers in promoting community engagement in Arctic science presently, which points to a real interest, a genuine interest in engaging in that sort of science. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for that opening statement. We're going to ask you to move your boom up a little bit higher just for the interpreters. Thank you very much. We will now turn to Dr. Shadian for your opening statement of 5 minutes.
Great, thank you, and thank you for this invitation. My comments today come from my own experiences living and working as an academic and a researcher in the Arctic and on Arctic issues for more than 2 decades. My PhD is in international relations. I've lived and worked in Iceland, Northern Norway, Lapland, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, the UK, and the US before Canada, and now becoming CEO of Arctic 360. Among its activities, Arctic 360 focuses on Arctic research in that we help translate primary research into knowledge for the general public, and we're part of 2 international research projects related to that. And for today's discussion, we focus on science policy and strategy related to innovating out of the Arctic. So climate change is real. It's impacting the whole of the Arctic region. In Canada, it affects Indigenous and all Northerners' security and well-being, and Canada's national security and prosperity. Canada's climate change research is focused on both understanding climate change and its impacts, not least its impacts on Northern communities, as well as adaptation. However, our approach to adaptation has, in my mind, been limited because I feel that we undervalue academia's potential and because we lack an Arctic strategy. I'll explain. Our Arctic neighbors are using the challenges posed by climate change to innovate, prosper, secure, and strengthen their own Arctic communities and national security. Sweden's Arctic strategy, for instance, focuses on the opportunity its Arctic climate creates, enabling innovation to scale for global export. It explains that Sweden's world-leading Arctic innovation clusters, there, knowledge is transformed into new products and services through collaboration between business, academia, the public sector, and by small enterprises in sub-supplier chains. It goes on, Arctic conditions like cold climate and sparsely populated areas make it possible to provide test and demonstration environments for aviation, automotive, and space industries. Norway's own Arctic strategy states, Quote, further developing North Norway as a strong, dynamic, and highly competent region is the best way to safeguard Norwegian interests in the Arctic. The government, it goes on, will support innovation, entrepreneurship, and startups in the North, and specifically Northern ocean-based industries, the maritime sector, petroleum, green power-intensive manufacturing, mineral extraction, agriculture, tourism, and space infrastructure. Norway's Arctic Cluster Team, for its mission, for instance, is to build expertise, develop innovation, and contribute to the commercialization and scaling of solutions for new green value chains, digital transformation, and infrastructure for innovative development. Finland, home to its Arctic VTT Technical Research Center, turned a section of the Norwegian-Finnish E8 Interstate Arctic Highway into a testing track for EVs, precisely because the road is snowy, icy, dark, windy, and with extreme weather. The road includes built-in sensors to measure vibration, weight, pressure, acceleration, surface slipperiness, etc. Longyearbyen in Svalbard had its own housing pilot project consisting of 3 building blocks worth of new apartments. And we can use housing in the north. The project installed sensors into the ground to measure the impacts of steel construction on the changing state of permafrost. And that knowledge will be used to build more climate-resilient infrastructure going forward. Meanwhile, in Canada, a Iqaluit's 94-room hotel and conference center built in 2019 used modular hotel rooms fabricated in and imported from China. The whole in Nunavut does not have its own university. Initiatives such as the Northern Transportation Adaptation Initiative, which were mentioned in previous sessions, are important and did include cooperation with industry, and the focus was on adaptation, but not innovation. And so, for instance, the project employs thermal siphon foundation systems to address permafrost melt. However, the technology itself is patented in and imported from the United States. And this gets to the bigger strategic shortcomings when it comes to Canada's Arctic research. ICED, for example, is missing in the north. Despite an office in Newfoundland and Labrador, Saskatchewan is responsible for the whole of the Northwest Territories, Montreal for all of Nunavut, and BC for Yukon. Though 75% of Canada's coastline is its Arctic, there's not an Arctic-based, like literally based, supercluster project there. And these shortcomings, though, I think are part of a much bigger conversation about the overall value, potential, and role of the North in Canada's consciousness. We often see, challenges and crises and possibility. Our neighbors see opportunity for research and innovation. They know that strong northern regions are the key to being strong Arctic nations, and they make the necessary strategic investments. When has the many conversations we have about R&D, innovation, startups, VC and pension fund investments, when have they focused on actually maybe innovating out of the North? But this requires national vision, leadership, strategic thinking, and all really relates through an Arctic strategy. It needs to connect the dots between science, and I'm including obviously indigenous knowledge, innovation, defense, capital investments, building northern capacity and infrastructure to address the needs of Northerners, build new knowledge, foster an innovation ecosystem in the North, and that will enable a sustainable, secure, and prosperous North and advance Canada's Arctic leadership.
Thank you. That's our time. Thank you very much. So we'll start with our first round of questioning, and that will be started with MP Tucker for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony here today. To Mrs. I'm sorry, Jessica Shadeen, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Shadeen is fine.
All right. Very much enjoyed your testimony and your common sense kind of approach to things. Going back into some of your past work, in your 2018 brief to the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, you argued that the surest way to protect Canadian sovereignty is to fix the infrastructure gap in the North. It is now 6 years since that statement. Have we fixed the infrastructure gap in the North?
No, and possibly it's gotten much worse, but this comes back to this piece on Arctic science and innovation. The fact that we have such an infrastructure gap is a huge opportunity if we look at it that way, because we could be world leaders in trying to determine, second half of the 21st century infrastructure, and that can survive and thrive basically in the North, in the Arctic, in cold extreme weathers, and with permafrost melt. And these technologies and innovations can then scale, and they can scale well beyond not just Canada and not just throughout the Arctic, but throughout other parts of the world. I will say that. I'll leave it there.
And on that, though, so how can we ensure that there is more investment in the north then? Not just public government dollars, but investment in the north then?
Well, that's where I've taken, a lot of insight from some of our Nordic neighbors, where they seem to have a nice, they're strategic, but they have pretty strong partnerships that involve academia and then also private companies that then also kind of attracts kind of that VC startup type of capital, intertwined with, with policy. So you have academia, you've got, new innovations coming out of that through startups, and then you've got private capital, you've got public funding, because I think public funding is absolutely essential and kind of the nucleus around which all of this needs to happen.
And just speaking on the some of the solutions that research is being conducted in the north. Earlier today, we heard about requiring some of the research being done to include measurable outcomes and hopefully solutions. We keep studying the same problem over and over again and not coming up, in my mind, with actual solution. Mitigation is important. Adaptation is crucial, in my view, in the north. What would your comments be on that?
Yeah, well, I see. This is where I think like new knowledge and primary knowledge and applied science kind of intersect. If we think about things around, let's say, the fact that we need to still continue to do, we are missing a lot of baseline studies. We need to do much better monitoring, but this also can be then connected to, we need to have, more sophisticated technologies. We should be able to utilize sensors to be able to help then collect real-time data at the same time. But again, then this kind of goes back into having a better strategy. What do we want to do? What do we want as an Arctic nation, our North and our Arctic to look like? What does it mean in terms of everything from economic development to defense? I'm thinking like the Diana program through NATO. And because NATO now is increasingly focused on the Arctic, obviously some of these innovation pieces are going to be focusing on, cold weather technologies. And so
just on that, we've got limited time. Thank you so much. Just switching gears a little bit on energy security in the north, I think it's horrendous how much diesel that we ship up there and burn for electrical needs. There has been some work that you've done, the Arctic 360 group has done on SMRs, and just what could it mean for a northern community if there was an SMR or a micro reactor located there?
Well, I think it's community dependent. And so I think we need to be, this kind of goes back to some of the earlier discussion that we had in the past session about we need to be looking, we need to be doing more economic assessments, financial assessments, energy economic assessments in the north, but we also need to be thinking strategically. And so I think SMRs are probably hopefully going to be something that's that we can utilize in various communities, but it also needs to be attached to something that's much bigger. What is the energy plan for the north? What is going to be that sustainable energy infrastructure that we're using? What do we do in the interim? How are we connecting this? How are we making things multi-purpose, multi-user? Because we need energy not just for heating, but we need it for, if we're going to have more internet. We need more internet. We need energy systems for a whole host of things, and for defense. How do we think more strategic?
I always thought that if a community was welcoming of nuclear, to have a military base of some sort in the north, close to a natural resource project taking place that would help that community if they're welcoming of technology such as SMRs or microreactors. How would that kind of work its way through the community?
Right. I would say that communities in the north, there's a lot of differences, but are in many ways like communities in other parts of Canada. It's filled with all types of peoples and personalities, and people and personalities who have different ideas about what they would like to see for their own futures and their own communities. And so it's nothing, writ like across the board, everyone thinks the same. I'd also say that from all of my experiences and everybody I know in the north, people want solutions. They want things to be better, as I always, as I always hear and how it's always said. They don't want to just survive; they want to thrive. And so, it's kind of in that mentality. And so the status quo is not okay, and they're looking for for ways to work with
Thank you
others
so
and move
much.
forward.
That's our time. Thank you. We'll now turn to MP Longfield for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses who are calling in from various places, including closets. The places that we work from sometimes aren't ideal, but thank you for taking the time, and welcome home to Dr. Brunet. I'm also calling in from Guelph, and it is muggy here. Could you tell us a little bit about the conference that you just returned from? Is there an output that could be used in the study that we're doing?
Are we talking about Arctic Congress right now?
Yes.
Oh, I hadn't prepared for that one.
No, if not, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll rephrase it. If we're doing a study on Arctic science and there's anything from that conference that's obviously is going to be very current that could help us with our study, maybe you could just send a copy into our clerk. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I know that the University of Guelph has been spending a lot of time in the Arctic, and great for you to do what you're doing. I also know that Dr. Shoshana Jacobs has been up there in Cambridge Bay. We've had some work done on mesh technology for internet connections, something I think you may be working alongside. Could you maybe talk about how Southern solutions could possibly help with some of the new technologies for communications in the North?
Right. So I don't really know much about the mesh technologies. I did work a bit actually with, that's a researcher you may want to speak with, a colleague of mine that you may know in my department. Sorry, her name is escaping right now. But yes, we did a bit of work on communications. You know, lately, I'd say in the last 5 years, I went from barely even being able to make phone calls with colleagues up there to having Zoom meetings. So there has been a tremendous change very quickly. Is it reliable and affordable? No. And so the strategy that I've adopted in a lot of my work and colleagues is that we actually embed budgets within our research budgets to cover community costs to connecting to Starlink and these types of strategies, which is what's being done right now. In terms of upcoming technologies, I'm not super familiar with what's happening in that area. So.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to.
And it was Helen Hambley, actually.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yes.
Yeah,
so she's working a lot on that. Exactly. So she's been working a bit with me, and we published a paper a few years ago on that topic. But she's the sort of expert in that. So.
Well, she's done incredible work to get rural Ontario up to speed with broadband, especially locally even. And her work is, I guess, reaching farther than I realized.
I roped her in to a project, yeah.
Well, as you know, there's a lot of federal money going into broadband and into communication networks, and I'm glad to hear that she's also working with you through some of the funds that she's got from the federal government. Also on the social development piece, that was also mentioned in our last panel, how we need to think of more than just environmental impacts. Any more expansion that you could do on the idea of how we need to look at a more holistic approach to supporting research in the Arctic?
Yeah, so I actually focus mostly on the human, social, cultural outputs of research as a core of what I do. I look a lot at the way various elements of what we call capacity, which I'm sure is a word you've heard ad nauseum at this stage. Yeah. But I do try to break down this word capacity and what it means in this context. And yeah, so research, it's a tough thing to correlate more research with more northern capacity building. But it is kind of what I study. Has it evolved substantially? Yes. The problem right now that I'm seeing is that the usual suspects, the people who have tremendous capacity, are being burnt out by our southern demands on them. So we need to broaden the number of people who can respond to that demand. And that happens by having institutions up there that are, like I talked earlier, like Yukon University. We need to have a university in Iqaluit, and it is happening slowly. There's wheels turning there, but I think that will change everything.
So we just approved scholarships and fellowships, which actually made its way into the budget, something the Conservatives voted against. Scholarships and fellowships are a big part of improving capacity.
To Northerners, you mean?
Yes.
Or for Northerners? Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's just having that institutional presence is a game changer. I'd say look at other territories, because I'm speaking mostly about Nunavut right now, but I did used to work a lot in the Yukon, and I'd say the next few years we're going to see Yukon University playing a central role in Northern research, just because it's a degree granting place. It's drawing in tremendous talent. So it's bringing capacity back from the south of Northerners back to the north, and that is just amazing to see. So I really believe in that strategy.
Tremendous. I'm getting close to the end of my time, but I just want to say that getting solutions from the north in the north is going to be a very important step that we make as a government going forward. Thank you both. I'm sorry I didn't get to Ms. Shadjian, but I know someone else will want to ask questions to you. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Longfield. Okay, we will now turn to MP Blanchard-Jurka for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm very happy to see our witnesses for this second hour of study. Professor Brunet, Franco-Ontarian, University of Guelph. I'm a Quebecer. So what, in that case, we're going to speak to each other in our common language, in French. I studied your curriculum vitae and the different work that you have done. I see that you've done northern research in terms of digital. What did you observe in terms of climate change? What did you see that remains to be done by the federal government to better structure what is now being done in the north? Well, I'm looking at this, and I would say that the mistake that we make as scientists is to center our research, and we've been speaking about it today, the development of capacity. And I'm sure that you've heard this here before from witnesses. We have difficulty developing tangible, concrete strategies for the north because we tend to apply southern solutions to the north. That's our default, and that's how we proceed. The research that I do is to try to develop in climate study a certain level of competency and to further exchanges in that area. In the most recent group, somebody here mentioned a co-leading, and that is important. Much of what is published today, perhaps since 5 or 6 years now, is really something that is co-led. We want to work together. We want to include northern knowledge. We have to be able to work together to develop the policies that are needed. So that is something that is perhaps not well understood by some people. Some people, you quantify knowledge that otherwise is set aside. I think it should be included in the knowledge base. It's difficult to address this, but we want to include figures. But what can we do to validate the people in the north, to find strategies that will help everyone? Thank you, Mr. Brunet, Professor. You spoke of co-development and people from the north and who are studying northern studies at Laval and have many years of research on that. I'm going to turn to something more pragmatic. I have a pragmatic question. When you have Indigenous people on their own land looking at a scientific research? Are they saying and seeing the same things that we are seeing and saying? We make public policy, and what we see may lead us to move on to something else. So you, as an expert, I'm asking you, what can be done? I can say it's very rare that this might happen because really when you're looking at the same problem from completely different angles and when you find different findings, there is complementarity. You have to understand as well that it's not just a matter of data, of information. It's a way of proceeding. It's a way of developing knowledge together, developing professional relationships, how to do our work as scientists. And so we can't forget that. That gives us a type of guide for working together. Now, with respect to problems, I would say this. Go back to governance. Ask yourself, why are we doing this, right? We have to ask ourselves this question as a team. When you have local people, Indigenous people, whatever, who are sitting around a table, we can work things through by asking ourselves questions like that and weighing our differences. And we find out that the differences aren't as weighty as we see or as large as we might have thought. So really we're dealing with thinking things through in terms of the conflict. So this is something that is a process that is recognized as a scientific one by professional scientists. But I'm a legislator. What can you tell us to help us? What opinion should we base our decisions on? When you have Indigenous people saying one thing and when you have scientists saying another, who do I listen to? Well, that is a very good question. And I ask myself that question very often. If we have a tendency to step back from things as scientists and look at them objectively. We look at the polar bear and we see the differences in perception between people that are taking a census of the polar bear, but using helicopters to do that, and then put that against people in the village who can tell you from looking at the animals on the land, there are more of them, there are fewer of them. We have observed this in their behavior. They are right, both, but science is complementary.
You can send additional comments through the clerk, or perhaps we can resume this in the second round. We will now turn to MP Cannings for his 6-minute round.
Well, thank you. Thank you to both witnesses. I'm going to continue with Dr. Brunet. You talked about capacity in the north and a situation that's throughout a lot of rural Canada, not just the north, but especially acute in the north, as you mentioned, to do any amount of work, and especially science and research. This committee did a study a few months ago on citizen science, which used the talents and enthusiasm and in some cases the direction of local people, not trained scientists, but who were doing projects that were scientifically designed by trained scientists. The data was gathered in a proper way and analyzed. I'm just wondering if that model could be used combined with your thoughts on having small institutes across the Arctic that could be service centers for this, that would help us get around that capacity issue.
Yeah, so the concept of citizen science is one that's definitely not easily applicable in the Arctic. Even the term citizen is a bit fraught in these contexts, but I would say that the problem with the model of citizen science goes from folks like myself who might be looking at blue jays in the backyard and not knowing anything about ornithology to people that could be experts in that area. Within Indigenous context, it sort of undervalues the idea of Indigenous knowledge and that level of expertise, which is, multi-generational. I'm sure you've heard of Indigenous knowledge over the last few weeks, and it tends to have some form of resistance. I would say that within Indigenous communities, there are people who are known experts who have the knowledge that can contribute to these types of projects and are already engaged in science tremendously. And in fact, those are some of the people that are kind of burning out because of us, because of our demands on their time, our increasing demands on their time, because we're talking about these things now and they are important. Those experts are being drawn. I work with youth a lot, Inuit youth, and we are trying to develop these types of programs, trying to value their knowledge, but also that the fact that they have a foot in a more Western perspective. They use cell phones and they're very tech savvy, right? And so we're trying to find ways to apply that sort of model, but we tend to call it community-led monitoring, community-based monitoring programs, which is something that I do work a lot with, DFO and ECCC to establish, mostly with youth in terms of building that capacity from the ground up. So yes, good model, maybe a different name, I would say, within this context.
Yeah. No, I totally appreciate that slant and an important one, and thank you for bringing that up. But I'm just wondering if, how can we build up that capacity without burning out the few people that have that capacity right now?
I think it comes back. Sorry.
No, it's an issue I encounter a lot in my previous life working with Indigenous communities in the South. I've encountered that same exact issue, and how do we support those communities and carry out the research that they want to see carried out, that's important to them and their lives, without overtaxing them. How can the federal government help?
I think it comes back to the other witness here, is that communities are heterogeneous. The wants and desires of communities, quote unquote, are difficult to understand. I tend to work with certain leadership groups to understand that, and I tend to talk to people. That's kind of what I do, right? I talk to people about what they want in research. This is exactly kind of the things I do. So once you've kind of established that, then it's a whole bunch of different things that I'm doing also right now, which is around what do you need to do good research in town? And I've got an active research project right now around research infrastructure in communities, and what does that mean? And one of them is, like I said earlier, is community space. There's nowhere to do anything. And I work in pretty big, we're thinking Pond Inlet, for instance, which is a relatively big hamlet in Nunavut. And, there's an Environment Canada research station that's pretty small. And there's no real physical space for community research to happen. And that's the point I was kind of trying to drive home earlier, is that we tend to think of Arctic research as being outside, on the land. But what about writing grants? What about, analyzing data? What about lab space for communities? Some are doing it. They're partnering with, like I'm thinking Université Laval. You talked about the Centre d'études nordiques earlier. These are places that are building research stations actively and trying to establish good partnerships in designing those. But I do think that'll really help. And like I said earlier, I think the idea of more than something like Arctic College, which is wonderful, but there's not very many people there in Iqaluit. Having a degree granting university in Nunavut would be tremendous, because people could train there instead of coming south. I've had a few students, colleagues in Nunavut, try to come south to do a degree, and it often didn't lead to any good outcome for them.
Thank you, Dr. Burnett.
And I'll stop it there. Yep.
I'm afraid that's our time, but thank you.
Yep.
So now we will turn to our second round of questions, and kicking that off will be MP Lobb for 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much, Madam Chair. And I appreciate both the comments from both our witnesses here today, this hour. To Professor Shadian, in your bio, I noticed that you state You spent 20 years living and working throughout the Nordic and North American Arctic as a researcher, professor, and consultant. And I don't mean any offense to any of the other witnesses that have appeared through all of our many meetings that we've had on this topic, but few can say that they've lived and worked and researched in the area for 20 years. Any thoughts on the advantage that gives one? And also, is that something that we should be looking more at, and is it feasible?
I'm sorry, you're on mute.
I want to clarify that I have been doing Arctic research and as an Arctic researcher for 20 years, and I have lived in the Arctic for 6 of those, let's say. So I wanted to be clear on that because I don't live in the North right now, for instance. I think spending time in the North is absolutely necessary to have any sort of perception or understanding or context or appreciation for if you want to do research there or focus on there. I think it should be for, like, let's say if we're in Canada, any Canadians should go to our own North. For me personally, though, living in the North of Norway is what gave me so much of a contrast between living at 72 degrees north there and what our 72 degrees north looks like in terms of prosperity, economic development, people's, quality of life. And that has given me a lot of insight into thinking, why is it we think here everything's so impossible and it's just too cold and we can't do anything? I think there's a problem with some sort of national will and these ideas about the North, where when I lived there, I had amazing internet connectivity. I could be, in a tunnel or over a bridge. It doesn't matter. Still talking on the phone. So I do think if you want to be doing North and research, absolutely, you need to spend time there and not just 2 weeks, fly in, fly out, that type of thing, but on the ground. But I also think that we need more opportunities. So this goes back to having institutions, like full academic institutions in the North. We need more opportunities for people that do research of all sorts to go and want to do research in the North and be able to stay there and live there. I just was approached by a professor from mechanical engineering at U of T and wanted to be part of this last call with this Nordforsk-led international joint initiative for sustainable development in the Arctic. And he's part of this advanced coding technology center. And and so he approached, and he's like, I know you guys do innovation and out of the Arctic and this and that. And we have Indigenous, or 51% Indigenous led on our executive team. And so wanted to know if we'd be interested. And I said, well, this is interesting. So he had, he's like, I think we have this technology that could work for the North, even though his partners are in Norway and in Finland. I said, well, I don't know. We don't know. Let's make a research project around learning, basically, like what's needed in the North, and it's about infrastructure. So this cold weather technology that could be applied to infrastructure. And so I thought we would partner with an Indigenous group in the North, Satu Secretariat Incorporated, because they're trying to build the road. And I thought, this would be a nice merger of the two, because they can learn from one another about what kind of technologies and road infrastructure needs there are, what their technology does, and maybe who knows what would be the outcome of that collaboration. For some reason, Satu Secretariat Incorporated was not eligible for being the co-PI on this partnership, and so there was no application put forward. But it's this. Yes, you have to be in the North. You have to go to the North. You have to spend time. But we just need to have more. It shouldn't be like going to the moon. We should be able to just do research and go to the North.
Okay, do I have any time left here?
30 seconds.
Okay, so just to build on that, where I am in southwestern Ontario, I think sometimes people from Toronto think it's like going to the moon, where I am as well. But the point is, at Bruce Power Nuclear Plant in my riding, the CEO, Mike Renchek, mandated that anybody that wanted to do business with Bruce Power for their multi-billion-dollar refurbishment project had to set up an office in Bruce, Grey, or Huron counties and establish a workforce there if they wanted to do business. And I do feel like, as we look at last meeting, we had Norman Vincent talking about 40 different organizations doing research in the Arctic. that maybe that's part of the problem. It's not the problem, but we have to have these organizations setting up and making commitments in infrastructure and human resources to continue on with this, because there is a gap here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to MP Chen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee today. To Mr. Brunet, it sounds very promising that infrastructure is improving in the north. You mentioned being now able to get on a Zoom call, whereas having a phone connection in the past was challenging. My question to you is that with respect to big research, which requires not only infrastructure and meaningful Inuit collaboration, it also requires time. You've led multi-year projects in the north. How did the pandemic impact the progress of multi-year research?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I actually received a grant a couple of years ago to study how the pandemic influenced research and research innovation in the north during the pandemic, because we couldn't go anymore. And that's been a really interesting, I'd say, adventure in research, because we have this bizarre natural experiment that happened where suddenly, I know my federal colleagues, for instance, were flat out couldn't go for almost a year and a half or so. At one point I had a colleague at Environment Canada, actually, I went to the research station because he hadn't been so long and he was running it. And I had a bit more flexibility to go up. I'd say regrettably, I didn't find that a lot of these multi-year research programs were able to sort of keep going as normal while the Southern folks were not there. I do think, though, and this comes back to leadership in the North, some programs were able to keep going. Some of them had remote. I think this comes back to what Dr. Chadian said earlier around having remote sensing type equipment, where some of this equipment kept running and data could be collected. The ones that were the most successful had actually people collecting and looking at data locally as well. So they were trained and had that capacity within towns. I'm thinking I'm going to talk about one that you may have heard about, which is called Smart Ice. Smart Ice has become a social enterprise now, and they've got operators in a bunch of different, I don't know the number, but I'd say in Inuit Nunangat as a whole, I think Nunatsiavut and Nunavut at least, Eastern Canadian Arctic, and I think moving west, those programs did fine. They didn't need us to come up north anymore. And that's sort of my end game, perhaps, is to research myself out of a job, is really to build that. That took many, many years to do, to build that and build those partnerships and build in that training element to have that level of independence. But there are shining examples of this that we can look at for solutions.
Speaking of building partnerships, you said in your testimony earlier that local engagement has only increased slightly, that there are few or negligible Arctic-led studies. So coming out of the pandemic, I suspect it would be an opportunity to further the goals of enabling Inuit self-determination, which you have talked about, and incorporating Indigenous knowledge in the work that researchers do, as well as building capacity within Inuit communities to lead or govern Northern research. Has there been progress made coming out of a situation where multi-year projects have been impacted to re-envision how work is done up in the north?
I think the quick answer is I don't know yet what the output of the pandemic specifically has been. The work I've done, and this is maybe obviously it's a flawed tool, but it's a tool to try to measure that level of engagement and how meaningful it's been was to use published outputs, which may seem funny, but the rationale was to look at various different factors in research articles to understand how engagement has changed since the 60s. And I could send you this instead of talking about it, but yeah, that work ended in up to 2020, and I haven't really looked at what the implications will be or are of the last 5 years or so, 4 years or so since the pandemic started on those trends. So I'd say not the type of huge increase that we think we're going to see in engagement, I think is a reflection of the fact that Arctic science is huge. It's vast. There's so much work being done. And we tend to hear a lot about the work that's amazing, that's community-led, community-engaged, whatever. And we like to talk about it as academics. So sometimes we forget that there's about a 99% of research that doesn't do that. And that's a lot of what this work tried to shine a light on.
Thank you. So if you do want to send that additional information you referred to, we'd appreciate that. That would be great.
Yep.
So now we're going to turn to MP Blanchard-Joncas for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Chair. My next question is for Jessica Sheehan. I very much appreciated your presentation and your international experience. I'd like to hear from you what we can do to improve northern research here in Canada as well. It has been mentioned that Canada is not a leader in northern research. I would like to know concretely what other countries are doing better than us and what we can draw inspiration from.
Yeah, I think it just comes back to having, I think we need to have an Arctic strategy, and then within that, that's where the science component comes into that. And I mean, Canada has, I have been listening to I think I listened to every session from this study. We have amazing researchers in this country. I mean, I learned so much just listening. And they make massive contributions. But what I've also heard, and it is what I absolutely believe, it's all these people doing all this amazing stuff, but it's all over the place. And it's not ever fed back into like, here's our 4 goals like that we are going to do as Canada and be the best in the world at, and everything kind of somehow feeds into that. And the research then can be realized and acknowledged. It will come together and it'll have strategic purpose. And therefore, that's what I was saying. It's that intersection between new knowledge and applied science, because we have that ability to take all of what's going on, but it is kind of geared towards a purpose. And then the applied research is then where you have really obvious outcomes.
Madame
so I think the bigger issue, I would say, is that we just don't. We have a lot going on. We have no way to figure out what we have, what we're doing, and to make it actually then purposeful.
I want to have your opinion on this. For Canada to succeed, we have to have better coordination in northern research and a greater participation of the Indigenous people in the north. Would you agree that it would be that type of strategy that would have to be set out?
Absolutely. I do think in academic research, if you've been in the Arctic space, you co-develop. I mean, you just do. It's what and you have to. And that's where the good science and production of knowledge comes about. I mean, I think there's so much collaboration. There was Nicholas, you were talking about like Indigenous knowledge and then Western science. And it's, when you ask the right research question together, they complement one another. And I think we do really well at that. I think so. We have new knowledge, but it needs to be strategic. And that new knowledge is producing kind of information and knowledge for the more applied sciences. And those applied sciences should be and absolutely have to be and will be co-produced with this is housing technologies, infrastructure technologies, energy technology. These are things we could be leading the world on, but these are things that Northerners want and need. So there's every reason that this should not be collaborative. Therefore, we need more partnerships in engineering, architecture, economics, the whole gamut that was discussed earlier, business, finance. And I don't understand why we don't have more indigenous people in the North, and it's because we don't have universities who have finance degrees and have startup companies of their own. So it goes back and forth. It's all over the place.
That's our time. Thank you so much. So for the final question, we turn to MP Cannings for 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I'm going to continue with Dr. Shadian. I just want to start off with maybe a little reality check comparing the Canadian Arctic with other Arctics, especially in Europe. Yes, and I appreciate your experience in northern Norway, and yes, Tromsø is on the same latitude as Tuktoyaktuk, but it has a population of over 60,000 in that township. That's twice the size of all of Nunavut in one town, and 20 times the size of Inuvik. And it's much warmer. It has more of a climate like Prince Rupert. So I'm just putting a pin on comparing the challenges we have in the Canadian Arctic. I think are much bigger and vaster. Why would we test EVs in Inuvik when we could do it in Edmonton or Saskatoon in the same conditions? But I really appreciate your mention of housing, because I think that's a critical part of the challenges we have in the Arctic and where we could be leaders. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe spend the rest of this time on housing, what we should be doing in researching housing and building it in the North.
Well, again, it's a bigger holistic picture. Well, first of all, we don't have a lot of people living in the North because we can't even house the people who do live there now. We need new technologies for housing, and this goes back to why don't we bring the best and brightest people together? That includes Northerners, of course, as well, and figure out what's an appropriate house, how it should be built, but how we are building then to ensure that it can withstand permafrost. It's resilient to permafrost, cold weather. And these technologies should be able to then scale out because there's climate change going on everywhere and there's cold weather in other places besides the Arctic. I have to say, though, this is because our North is so big, why isn't that not also then an opportunity? I mean, we have a massive coastline. We have opportunities to be taking advantage and making the best out of our North. And our Northerners want to have secure, safe, happy, successful lives there. It's, how much of our, over 40% of our land mass is our North. So to just kind of write it off that it's different and it's hard, and it's difficult, I have a hard time with that. I feel there's a lot of opportunity. People in the North want those opportunities. We just need to have some sort of national will, and we've got to start somewhere. Well, we need houses, but how are we going to have more houses if we don't have energy? If we don't have water?
Thank you.
So
that is our time. Sorry, there's never enough time. Thank both of the witnesses, Dr. Burnett and Dr. Shadian, for your testimonies and participation in the committee's study of science and research in Canada's Arctic in relation to climate change. So if you do have any additional comments or documents you want to submit, please feel free to submit that to the clerk. And is it the will of the committee to adjourn our meeting today? Thank you for your hard work today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.